Um, a bit of background behind this. So we have a new app called Binary Video Analysis, and I've partnered with a video analysis company, and really the driver for me it started as I guess a labor of love, and really for me is whenever I look at performance, I have my bias, and my bias is based on what I see and what I think looks fast, and my bias is going to be based on what I think needs to improve to make people faster or decelerate quicker, or more effectively, and be more efficient. I've got this bias, and I've always been someone that I've been challenged to believe myself sometimes. You know, I've had players run faster, like elite athletes run faster, players rehab quickly from ACLs and stay fit. But I always wonder, is there a better way? And then when discussing with Damien and discussing with a lot of people, the language that we're using is all based on data. But most of the time during my workshops, I recognize people don't video what they do. They have data to support it, but they don't always video it. So my questions around deceleration and strategy of deceleration have forced me to go and start to visualize what I see, or start to create visuals of what's happening and make sense of the world. So that's a tiny bit of an intro. What we have is this need to start to understand how the numbers connect to the movement. And so I'm constantly wondering, how do we start to make sense of deceleration? And actually, it's almost exactly the opposite, but similar to how we look at initial acceleration. You know, people talking about drive index as almost a new term that James Wild brought to my attention. And I think some of the research has come from Neil Bezodis. And actually talking to Damien about what might be a braking index is something that's quite interesting to me at the moment. And so all we've done is try to go away, look at different strategies in running. I haven't got a main conclusion yet. This discussion with you guys is really more about almost a call for you guys to go away and start to clarify what is good versus bad. Or what are the different strategies of maybe stiffness-based versus power-based strategies, and how do we create almost a consensus of what that could look like? And I can show you a bit more video, but you know, here are some of the data points that we can get from a deceleration, and I've chosen again off of Damien's request and suggestion, an exercise of literally accelerating in 20 meters. And stopping on a mark. Traditionally in teams, I've done 505s. I've done all types of pre-planned agility exercises. I think I liked the idea of this accelerating to a standstill and then a back pedal, because it takes away some of the technical aspect of having to rotate and having to brake whilst rotating your upper body. I think that's a really important skill set, but when it comes to trying to almost quantify deceleration, braking strength, or I guess eccentric qualities, I didn't want it to be limited as much by skill. It's always going to be limited by some skill, but I wanted to take some of that out. So when looking at it, when looking at a player, or my son in that last video, decelerating, we can see that there are a number of metrics to look at. And I'm a dyslexic. When I look at all these numbers, it's just like I can make sense of it, but it's not really intuitive to me. But when we start to look at maybe how those numbers look like in curves, sorry, I'm trying to pause this so you can see it exactly. When we start to look at how these numbers look like in curves, it starts to give us a bit more of an understanding. There are different strategies potentially. There are different ways that people find themselves coming to a halt. Some of them do it in almost an imbalanced way, one leg taking more load, like what you might see up here. Some of them maybe just distribute it quite almost evenly across each leg. And some of them do most of these deceleration really early on, and then take the rest of the time to almost get their bodies into position. But again, this isn't an intuitive way for me, but actually it starts to paint a picture of the different ways, the different strategies that people potentially are potentially organizing themselves in order to stop. So hopefully I can show this next one. So of those different strategies, sorry guys, I'm seeing clearly that sometimes you find people that perhaps are, their strength to weight ratio is really high. They're clearly, more specifically, their eccentric strength to weight ratio is pretty high. They're able to really put the brakes on really early in the run. They're able to sit really deeply, and their contractile tissue takes a large amount of that load. And I'm seeing this, and it's making sense. And then I'm seeing other individuals, and this is the one that's struggling to download. I'm seeing other individuals, if you forgive me 1 second, I'm not going to do it. I'm seeing other individuals that are potentially staying more upright, are keeping their legs straighter. Their touchdown distance is relatively low. Their hips are higher, and potentially they are taking more load through their passive tissue. They're potentially taking more load through their skeletal structure, and using that. And it's the same thing I see in fast bowling, same thing I see in sprinting, that you have some individuals that are far more comfortable allowing their connective tissue to take more of the load, and it's more contractile. And you have some people that are better at using their skeletal structure and potentially some more joint coupling to be able to support the development of that force. So it's really, guys, this is a question to you guys. I've got invited onto this, but it's not me trying to preach that there's a specific strategy that is best. I've worked with some amazing players, especially sevens players, who can literally cut almost, it looks like they're going bone on bone. There's a straight-legged, and definitely there's very minimal amortization, minimal joint bend, and they're able to take that load. Some might suggest that's, that might create potential for injury in the long term. Conversely, there are scenarios like the individual on the screen where people can really drop their center of mass, can really sit into the deceleration. As a result, they have a really long or large touchdown distance, how far away their foot is away from their hip, and they're able to really take the load through essentially through a contractile element. Now, this clearly is going to add more load to the tissue. So I think either way, high performance is always going to be close to this injury line or close to this really high load place. So it's kind of a question to you guys. I think the first question is, what are the key metrics that make sense to you? What we've done with the binary app, and like I say, it's a labor of love and we're still evolving it. We've started from what we would initially, like our first step of looking at what matters to us. So on our first step, in the boxes up here, we've got hip projection distance, we've got leg speed or hertz frequency. We've tracked the speed of the hip going throughout each section. So this is the average velocity during each step. We've got step length, we've got air time to ground contact. So that to me just gives us a basic picture. On our next page, we've got something looking at, and there's a bug in our system as of yesterday, but I think it's out already. Apparently I got an email this morning, but looking at normalized average horizontal external power. So again, another metric that James Wild has made really clear that we should be looking at either acceleration or external power. So we've got both on the screen here. And then lastly, we've got deceleration on the screen here. And then lastly, we're looking at trunk angle, shin angle, and potentially how the velocity changes, or which will give us a picture of how velocity changes across the deceleration steps. So I think for me, and this is where I'm going to end, for me, I want to ask you guys, and I would love to be able to come up with some kind of clarity as to what data points make the most sense to you, how we as a community can go forward to create research and data and strategies that are easily accessible to the masses. And that's really what I'm about. I'm not about just creating data or creating a process that only professionals who really understand it can make sense of it. I really want to be able to make it really clear to everybody. And that's why visualizing it, connecting the data with what we see in the movement makes the most sense to me. So apart from that, I'm happy for any questions. I've kind of really just, I talk fast sometimes, maybe if I'm nervous or I'm not really sure. But you can unmute yourself if you like. If there's any questions that you want to ask, really happy to go with it. And how about unshared my screen? Yeah. I cannot hear anyone if anyone is talking.
Hi, Jonas. Nick Ward here.
Hi, Nick.
I just want to draw kind of a link to some research that was done back in the early 90s when you're talking about the preference for the upright stance and the more squat stance, and
yeah,
just making a link that may be totally irrelevant. But I know Walter Herzog's group out of the University of Calgary did work on looking at the moment length relations of rec fem in speed skaters, cyclists, and runners.
Yeah.
You know, almost suggesting that either whatever someone was born with or what they trained into, maybe gave them a preference, you know. And just because with team sports players, of course, they're so varied in their biomechanics and the makeup that they come in, that, as you suggested, maybe there isn't a right or wrong strategy, and maybe that apparent more extended pattern may just be there because of some underlying morphology or preferences that way. So I just want to draw a connection to that particular research to sort of throw that in the stirring pot right now.
Great, and I totally agree. And you know, some of the guys we've seen, especially the taller, perhaps the lower strength to weight ratio guys, that this longer, and I call it bone on bone, but I know I shouldn't say it that way. More straighter leg position is what is their preference. But we've seen that change. We've seen that change over time as they've been exposed to more physical conditioning, really, and also the drill. So there's clearly going to be some, you know, getting used to doing things before people start to challenge their strategy. But I think that's great. Who was the research by in Calgary?
Walter Herzog. This particular paper is from MedSci Sports and Exercise in 1991. Herzog et al.
Fine. Thank you very much. John, we can't hear you.
Excellent. Okay, so what I'll do is at the end, I'll pull together any resources that were mentioned, any resources that any of the speakers want to submit, and I'll send a joint email and just send all the resources, including that Herzog paper. Could I just ask a kind of practical based question there, Jonas? You mentioned physical conditioning, and I'm just wondering what would be your go-tos in relation to deceleration?
My go-tos, I think the first go-to is easy, just basic strength. I think when you have basic strength qualities, it seems to make the deceleration simpler and easier. If I want to teach it and I want to train it, I'm probably more likely to use plyometrics and spend a lot of time almost in the earlier stages of plyometrics and getting people to understand how to absorb and how to use their bum to absorb as well as their knee to absorb. I think a lot of football players or team sport players would always preference to using their knees purely to absorb and don't know how to use their bum, don't know how to, and if they want to get some hip flexion, they're more likely to get it through dropping their trunk than sitting using their bum. We have some Neuro Excellence supply us with some what they call like a Vertimax type thing, or a Versa pulley is really what I'm talking about. So we know flywheel work is going to be great for eccentric qualities, but I'm probably more likely to do acceleration to a dramatic stop. So the ACL rehab guys, we spend a lot of time doing accels to stop. and progress with the distance they have to run in before they stop, and do multiple stops in a row.
Okay, can I hit you with two other, again, practical questions?
Yep.
One, you mentioned plyos. Is there a bias towards either horizontal, vertical, or do both? And then second, and I guess this might go for either players who were previously injured or players who perhaps are a little older or more miles in the tank. Do you find people preferentially loading up one foot for their first aggressive or decelerative step? And then what type of tactics have you used in practice to try and rebalance them or remediate that, or get them more able on both feet?
Yeah, so firstly, plyos, horizontal or vertical, it depends. I think if I really want to overload it and I trust that I can overload it, I'm going to drop them off of boxes, and I'm going to get them to stick off of boxes. So I guess it's going to have more of a vertical load. However, doing a single leg K-box type activity, a pulley pulling you in with, one leg on the floor, the other leg almost like you're in a split lunge or in a lunge position, and the pulley pulling you forwards, that has a massive horizontal moment on it. So that would be my go-to if I really wanted to create overload. But with my philosophy, I'm probably always doing a bit of both. So even in a plyometric session, if I'm getting ready for a really aggressive deceleration session, I would probably early in the session prepare their feet and just some joint coupling and almost just a nervous system with more vertical work. And then as I progress through the session, I'm going to add more horizontal. But if they're shit at catching a horizontal, like a broad jump, let's say I'm going to do multiple ball jumps in a row. If that really encourages them to only break through their knees, I'm probably going to make them do it more vertical. So I think that my exercise choice is always going to be dependent on the skill, because the skill level will dictate how much volume I can do. And actually, my bigger goal isn't just having a really intense stimuli, it's having enough repetitions of that stimuli for them to make sense of it from a movement perspective, as well as almost creating an extensive environment for I guess, growth. And in your second question,
so the second one was more around, and I guess the best example is someone's had an ACL reconstruction, and it might have been 5 years ago, 10 years ago.
Yeah.
But commonly we still see a lot of imbalances.
Yeah.
They may be not strength imbalances.
Yeah.
But their stability, their reactivity of the floor, things like that. So have you come across that phenomenon where someone will subconsciously look to decelerate off a preferential foot, and that might in turn limit their decision-making options and make them that bit more predictable? And then what could we do, or what have you found effective from a practical perspective?
Fine. Yeah, I definitely have seen that. I always use the example of a left back because it's one particular individual that it really opened my eyes. And he when defending was always able to turn counterclockwise and struggle to turn clockwise. So he could use the touch line and it was really good. But if someone cut him on the inside, he was done. He would have to go the long way around. And so what we found was there were definitely some deficits in his ACL leg versus the other leg. He ends up doing both, so it's probably not the best example. But finding ways to overload him and get him to overload that leg was important, the limiting leg. And that might be banded, 3 bands connected together, get him to walk back and get him to let the bands pull him in and then put the brakes on really quickly. He could really easily recognize that most of the deceleration went through one limb. It's really simple to ask him to load the other side. His strategy to load the other side was to keep a straight leg. And so encouraging him to sit into that side was really my main cue. Sometimes he would land toey on that side as well. So encouraging him to get a bit more of a heel to toe roll and sit into that side again became a big preference or an important part of the puzzle. But that gave him confidence. So once he had confidence, actually some of the work was more around acceleration, if I'm honest. because once he had the confidence to actually be powerful in that leg, to get a really good stimuli and to get more him ready to train, because he had to go back, was almost like just complementing the other components of being explosive, and putting him in scenarios where he could stress test his ability to accelerate, decelerate off of both legs. And so maybe the last point to that is there was this intermediary part where he was ready to train, was training with the team, but needed a bit of horse whispering, needed a bit of a reminder of some of the stuff we had done in his rehab, and just almost a confidence of that he can go and use that side, that he can be effective at accelerating, pushing off, cutting off of that side. So I think to be clear about your question, to answer your question, I would find ways to overload it. I'll be quite avert and tell him and show him on video. I use a lot of video with him and show him, and he can see the difference. Right, I'm really happy to heel strike, to sit back and really bend on one side and have a long ground contact essentially. On this other side, I'm pitter patter. So he was aware of it really early. And then I guess chasing the sensations, the good sensations from his good side, and chasing those same feelings on his other side was really the goal. And then reminding lots of activation and prep work prior to football to remind him that it's okay, that he can use it, that it's explosive. It's not a weak side, it's just the other side.
I think that was a good answer. And I guess it is one of the things that we conventionally neglect. We think about the mechanics of training and sets and reps and exercise design, and we often lose sight of the fundamental importance of the athlete actually believing in why they're doing what they're doing and seeing how what the coach is prescribing for them fits into their overall objectives. And I think that stuff we can't leave go. And I think historically we have focused more on the mechanical and not on the emotional buy-in. We're resolving the Damien issue. I'm just wondering, Ola, would you be happy to come in now? And I think there's a nice link from what Jonas has just talked about. Would you be happy to do your few minutes now?
Absolutely.
I'm aware Nick has got his hand up again, like in a classroom. I love this. I've never seen this before. So there you go.
Okay, so Nick, shout.
I've just thinking about the scope of deceleration, and I love the fact that you guys have introduced, obviously, the mind element to it. I think there's lots of examples of building confidence in movement patterns. A lot of the time when we talk about decelerations, we all seem to be talking about them in, oh shit, I shouldn't be here, I need to get out of here situations. So defensive situations, and kind of recovery situations. I'm also wondering about the other end of the spectrum where decelerations happen quite subtly rather than abruptly. And I know that a lot of the focus has been on the damage that decelerations do, but again, in terms of the wider context of the game, that maneuverability that top athletes can have to subtly readjust their body's velocity at higher speeds as well, if that's a scope for this topic, or are we purely trying to stay focused on the more damaging or apparently damaging aspects of deceleration?
Do you want me to take that, Jonas, or do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I can jump in. So I totally agree. I think the subtle elements of deceleration, like sometimes when we're doing speed, we do straight line running, we do some subtle curve type S's and swerves, and we do more abrupt cuts. And actually, until we get to the cuts, anything that's subtle, the aim is to maintain speed. And so we have this discussion, and those subtle curves will then involve a ball, then involve a partner almost trailing next to you, and so you're under a bit of pressure, and then involve one-on-ones. And really, in that scenario, it's like those subtle dinks and subtle movements, in my mind, and how I describe it to the players, is it's not about, this isn't a change of direction or deceleration drill. This is a speed drill. And the aim is to maintain speed. And then you'll notice the individuals who are perhaps more limited by skill are almost too heavy on the throttle and lose control. And so finding the right timing, being able to, again, put in those subtle decelerations and maneuver their bodies becomes an important factor. but weirdly enough, I rarely talk about it from a deceleration perspective. This is just my own two pence, 1 pence, 10 pence.
The only thing I'd add there is like there's very little kind of empirical research on that area, Nick. I mean, and it's a great question. And I think we're kind of back to the area of creating athletes with movement mastery. If they need to throttle down, you know, to be more unpredictable, to accelerate quickly, to decelerate quickly, we need to kind of give them those capacities. And I don't think we really know. We know more about acceleration, but deceleration has been a blind spot for so long. We haven't had good ways of measuring it. It's just been the opposite to acceleration, where in actual fact it's not. It's a different animal, and we need to have a slightly different training philosophy, or at least training mechanisms, when we're talking about it. If it's okay with everyone, what we might do then is hold any other questions for Jonas for the back end, and then I'll hand over to Ola now. Ola, if you're good to go.